Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to break down the incredibly complex 400-year history of African Canadians. Now, when most of us think about Canadian history, there's a very specific kind of idealized narrative that usually comes to mind, right? Well, today we're moving way beyond those common myths to uncover the unvarnished realities recorded in our history. Our goal here is to give you a clear, structured understanding of a deeply significant, yet frequently overlooked chapter in the shaping of a nation. Let's get started.
All right, let's jump right in by challenging a pretty widespread assumption. There's this deeply ingrained cultural idea that Canada has absolutely always been a perfectly welcoming refuge, a place with open arms for anyone fleeing hardship. But when we actually look closer at the history books, we have to stop and ask ourselves, was that actually the case for early Black immigrants?
Well, the jarring reality is that the typical warm welcome afforded to most immigrants was completely absent for early Black settlers. This wasn't just a feeling, it was a harsh, systemic truth. In fact, this was specifically highlighted during a massive 1910 push to actively block Black individuals from entering Western Canada. They were treated far more as undesirable tenants than as fellow Canadians.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by looking beyond the welcoming myth, address the reality of slavery on Canadian soil, and examine formal policies of exclusion. Then, we'll discuss the historical struggles shared with First Nations peoples, highlight some truly amazing overlooked legacies, and wrap up with the journey of reclaiming ancestral identity.
Okay, Part 1. Beyond the Welcoming Myth. Did you know that people of African descent have been an integral part of this land since way back in 1605? That's when Matthew da Costa arrived in Nova Scotia, marking the very first recorded person of African descent in the country. From that point on, we see these vast migrations of free people, loyalists, escaped slaves, and laborers pushing across the continent. They moved into the Maritimes, over to Ontario and Quebec, way out west to British Columbia by 1857, and finally settled the prairies in the early 1900s. Like so many others, they came seeking the dream of a better life and a release from turmoil.
Moving right along to Section 2, Slavery on Canadian Soil.
Now, this is an absolutely crucial point to understand. Black history in Canada is fundamentally built on the reality of slavery. And we have to be clear, this isn't just an American story. Slavery was practiced right here in Canada, and human beings were literally bought and sold on Canadian soil. This dark reality automatically sets the African-Canadian experience distinctly apart from other immigrant populations who arrived freely.
If you want a really stark look at this, Dr. Afua Cooper's book, The Hanging of Angelique, clearly illustrates the brutal and inhumane treatment the Canadian slaves were actually forced to endure. Now, you'll sometimes hear people argue that slavery in Canada wasn't quote-unquote as bad as it was in the United States. But let's be real. We must remember there's absolutely nothing humane about slavery in the first place, regardless of geography.
Let's look at Section 3, Policies of Exclusion.
Get this. In 1910, the Edmonton Board of Trade literally presented a signed petition to the Prime Minister, actively asking him to block Black people from coming into Western Canada. And Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier actually responded by putting a one-year restriction on American Blacks. By 1911, the Canadian government had even drafted a formal exclusion ordinance. Now, a change in government meant that specific law wasn't ultimately enacted, but the message was unmistakably clear. You are not wanted. It was a subtle, bureaucratic, but highly effective form of oppression.
Which brings us to Section 4, Shared Struggles with First Nations Peoples. There is a deeply powerful, albeit tragic parallel here when we look at shared histories of systemic erasure. For people of African descent, the trauma began by being forcibly snatched from their homeland, surviving the horrific Middle Passage in the belly of wooden boats, and facing total dehumanization. Similarly, Indigenous peoples were also enslaved early on. They were later forced from their traditional lands onto reserves and had their children taken by the RCMP to residential schools, where their language and culture were quite literally beaten out of them. Both groups endured unimaginable structural destruction.
So how did this legacy play out socially? It brings us to a concept known as restricted assimilation. This explains why, unlike other immigrants who certainly faced adversity but eventually fully assimilated while keeping their culture, African North Americans faced a deliberate ceiling on their societal integration. They were only allowed to assimilate into Canadian society to a certain point and absolutely no further. It's a documented history of conditional acceptance.
Now, let's shift gears for Section 5, Overlooked Legacies and Contributions.
Because despite all these massive systemic barriers,
African Canadians have fundamentally shaped this nation. I mean, they revolutionized Canada's favorite pastime through the Colored Hockey League of the Maritimes. Black men fought tirelessly for the right to defend the country, serving in the Victoria Rifles of British Columbia and the No. 2 Construction Battalion during World War I. We also see profound industrial innovation, like Elijah McCoy of Ontario, who invented the lubricating cup that completely changed railway travel. And we see huge political triumphs, such as Doreen Lewis of Nova Scotia becoming the very first black female mayor in Canada. These are monumental achievements, yet they're so often completely missing from our standard public school curriculums.
And finally, Section 6, Reclaiming Ancestral Identity.
You know, it's often said that history is written by the dominant society, and because of that, the records for enslaved ancestors are heartbreakingly sparse. If you go back to try and find your ancestors, the records might only note their height, their weight, whether they had good teeth, or if they were considered a good breeder. Because of this severe, systematic stripping of humanity, African North Americans basically became a people without an ancestral identity, literally forced to take on the surnames of the people who owned them.
Today, reconnecting with those roots means different terminology for different people. Some choose the term Black, others prefer African Canadian, while some older generations might still proudly state, "I am colored." But the ultimate takeaway here, the absolute core of this, is that respect breeds respect. And this is so vital today, especially when you consider that we still exist in an environment where some electronic policing systems actually continue to refer to Black people using outdated and highly offensive terms like Negro.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with something to chew on. Think about this. When a dominant segment of society beats a culture out of your ancestors and doesn't even deem your history significant enough to accurately record, how on earth can you be expected to fully know your own story? It challenges every single one of us to think critically about who gets to write history, what gets left out, and why understanding the complete, unvarnished truth matters so deeply for all of us today.